its neighbors in tax rates, you will probably see a lot of business flight. You will see a lot of people moving out of state to take advantage of tax differentials across state borders. So that limits the degree of taxation through competition between governments. And so a pro-growth strategy would require a heavy reliance on broad-based taxation of consumption as opposed to income. So if you wanted to have a faster growing economy, you probably want to tax consumption more than you tax income, maybe even eliminate completely the corporate and personal income tax if you're really looking for faster growth, and focus all of your revenue raising efforts on taxing consumption. Again, the idea is to create a very broad-based tax that taxes everything, the consumption of everything, services, goods, you name it, but at a very low rate, right? At a competitive rate, so that much of your activity stays in the state as opposed to living to another state. The problem with sales taxes, as most economists would point out, is that they're regressive, meaning that poor people pay a higher proportion of their income in sales taxes than the rich people do. And so sales taxes, for that reason, are not very popular with progressive-oriented minds who would like to, have a little bit more social justice and equality. But that problem I think that problem can be overcome to a large extent if we design the sales taxes or consumption taxes in a progressive manner. And that sales taxes could be tied to your income tax returns to alleviate that regressive burden on poor families and poor households. And so I think there is a great potential to make sales taxes less regressive and potentially progressive if you structure them the right way, if you make them very broad-based. So I think some of the criticisms of sales taxes could be addressed by a sophisticated design of the sales tax itself. And so, again, in summary, if you really want to stimulate growth, it's probably no better way to do that through a tax code than to rely more on consumption-based taxes, broad-based consumption-based taxes. Okay, so in theory, that's what we think about taxation. Now let's look at some evidence. Let's look at some comparisons between states when it comes to the tax policy. And so here are some graphs from the Tax Foundation, or some maps from the Tax Foundation, which provides a ranking of state business climate index according to their calculations. And higher numbers mean good things. So higher numbers for the index indicate a more business-friendly climate, business-friendly tax climate. And you can see that Pennsylvania is ranked number 19, which is pretty good. It's in a good middle of the pack. And we rank better than some of our neighbors, a little bit better than Ohio, a little bit better than West Virginia, a little bit better than Virginia, and much better than New York, New Jersey probably too. So you can see, this is the good news, right? So my presentation is not as dismal at all. We have a relatively decent ranking here. Not as good maybe as Wyoming or Texas, but still, relatively decent. When it comes to top state income tax rates, we also rank pretty well in Pennsylvania because we have, again, a flat income tax system of 3%. And so other states have much higher progressive income tax rates. Look at New York, for example. Theirs is 8.97. That's pretty high. Could we do as well as maybe Texas or Washington State if we had zero income tax? We could do better for growth if we had zero income tax. But again, where will the rest of the revenue will have to come from? Well, if we broaden our sales tax base, reduce the rate, maybe we could make up the difference through a sales tax, a very broad-based sales tax, and compete better for investment and labor that way. And so we could potentially, learn from states like Washington State and Wyoming and Texas and Florida maybe. By the way, where does Bill Gates live? He lives in Washington State. Is that a coincidence? Well, who knows? I don't know. Maybe he really likes those zero income tax rates. I don't know. Or maybe he likes Seattle coffee. I'm not sure what Bill Gates likes, but maybe that's not a coincidence that he lives in Washington State. Okay, so what's next? Sales tax. How does PA compare to other states in terms of sales tax rates? Again, kind of in the middle of the pack, a little bit higher than West Virginia in terms of the average sales tax rate, a little bit higher than Virginia. Can we make this better? Yeah, I think we can make pay sales tax rate more competitive by broadening the base, the tax base. We can include things that we typically don't tax, like food and I think clothing in Pennsylvania, right? We don't tax that, I think, unless there's some local exemptions to that. So if we include everything, if we tax almost everything, like how Hawaii does, for example, Hawaii, I think, taxes virtually 99% of their economic activity through a sales tax. That's why they can have very low sales tax rates, like 4.35. It's because they broaden the tax base to include virtually everything that you can possibly sell. They tax it at a very low tax rate compared to some other states, and that helps them to grow faster, certainly. Helps to minimize the inefficiencies associated with higher tax rate, because they broaden the tax base to include almost everything they could possibly tax, but tax it at a relatively low rate. Okay, and we're left with median property taxes, right? These are the taxes we collect at the local level, and you can see here that, again, Pennsylvania is kind of in the middle of the pack. Obviously higher tax rates than in West Virginia, but who wants to live in West Virginia, right? I'm just kidding. I spent a lot of time living there, so wonderful state. But you can see that we're again in the middle of the pack in terms of property taxes. Okay, let's look at Tax Freedom Day. Kind of an indicator of the size of government, right? How much you have to work till you pay off the size of government with your taxes. And so the Tax Freedom Day, again, provided by the Tax Foundation. These are tax calculations from the Tax Foundation. They show that Pennsylvania kind of, again, in the middle of the pack. So we are pretty close to our neighbors in the size of government per person. And again, we're doing much better than New York, but maybe not as well as some other states. Maybe let's look at some of the better ones. So Wyoming, right, is doing pretty well in terms of well, actually, no. Wyoming is not doing too well. I was looking at South Dakota. Yeah, South Dakota is doing much better than Pennsylvania, for example, or some other states. Okay, so let's look at another indicator of how well we compare to other states. This is the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom Index, specifically the tax component of the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom Index. And here we look at how good our tax climate is compared to other states. Higher numbers mean good things. So a higher number for Pennsylvania, for the overall taxation score, means we have relatively limited government with relatively limited intervention compared to the US average. So we outrank the US average by a little bit. However, we fall behind the US average in terms of reliance on revenue from own resources. Maybe this suggests maybe we should milk the federal government more. I don't know. Clearly, I don't support that. As previous speakers have said, it's a tragedy, it's a travesty for all of us when we milk the federal government for more money. But something else to look at, for example, top marginal income tax rate. Again, why are we ranked better than some other states? Because of the flat income tax system. And we only have 3%, as opposed to maybe 8% in New York. So that's a good news. What else we ranked relatively good? On sales taxes, this is just an index. It's relatively abstract, 0 to 10 maybe. So the higher number, the better you ranked. So, and sales taxes here, we are above the U.S. average, ranked above the U.S. average, meaning that we have relatively low sales tax rates, which is maybe a good thing if your tax base is pretty wide, pretty broad, right? So that's another aspect you need to keep in mind, how broad your tax base is. If we had a tax base as broad as in Hawaii, we could raise a lot more revenue with lower tax rates. Okay, let's look at how much we rely on different taxes. So as a percentage of total revenue, we collect about 27%, 28% of our revenue from sales taxes, which is a little bit below national average. And again, this is not necessarily bad or good, but this is just to tell you where much of the money is coming from. We rely relatively heavily on selective sales taxes, like taxes on gasoline, tobacco, maybe lottery, maybe something else. So specific goods like that. Sometimes we call them sin taxes because we tax some of the sort of undesirable behavior. And as you can see, we rely relatively heavy on those taxes in this state. Individual income tax, again, probably because of the flat income tax, we rely relatively little on the individual income tax compared to the US average. Unfortunately, we rely a lot on the corporate income tax compared to the US average. I think most economists would say that corporate income taxes are one of the worst taxes you can possibly have to raise revenue. They burden all kinds of people you don't want to tax, like consumers and workers. They raise very little revenue. They're very unstable over the business cycle. Kind of a pretty bad tax. You have lots of really negative things associated with the corporate and business taxation in general. So most economists would say, you know what, if you want to have stable revenue, if you want to know who you actually tax with your taxes, rely on personal income and consumption taxes as the best way to, to know who you tax and, have a relatively stable tax base over the business cycle. All right, now I got a couple more rankings for you here. Let's look at tax capacity and tax effort and see how Pennsylvania compares to other states in those two respects. So tax capacity is kind of the potential amount of money we could raise for the government. So that's pretty much close to being state GDP. So essentially tax capacity is being very similar to the overall level of economic activity. So essentially we're looking here at all taxable resources pretty close to GDP. And tax effort is how much of that tax capacity we are actually using. So tax effort is a good indicator of the overall tax burden, and tax capacity is kind of an indicator of how rich your economy is. And so when you compare tax capacity for several neighboring states and the United States, in comparison to Pennsylvania, you can see that we're a little bit below the US average in terms of income generating ability or tax capacity, and we are a little bit above the US average in terms of tax effort. So we do show a little bit more than average tax effort. Maybe we have narrowly defined tax basis, and one of the ways to lower tax effort is to increase the tax base, to broaden it so we don't have as much tax effort going to specific taxes to raise the sufficient amount of revenue. So we might be we might rank relatively well to some other states in this list, but on average, one of the ways to lower tax effort or to lower tax burden is to broaden the tax base and lower the tax rates and still be able to raise sufficient revenue. Another important aspect about tax policy and growth is that it pays off, in my opinion, to have a very long-term, stable tax revenue policy. I think some of the worst decisions, as Matt said, we need to guard, or was it Keith who said, one of the best ways to promote growth is to stop making bad decisions, or to prevent, our government from making really silly decisions. And I think many bad decisions arise during, bad years, during economic recessions, when politicians are scared, everybody is nervous, everybody is scared, and we're trying our hardest to come up with a solution. And maybe we're not very deliberate in that process, and maybe we often choose really bad solutions. And so one of the ways to avoid that is to come up with a long-term, sound tax policy that is providing us with stable revenue over the business cycle. No matter, if we have a recession or we have strong economic growth, we know we're going to have sufficient revenues to fund some basic core features of, government. And so let's look at ways to fund government in a very stable way as a way to eliminate, the potential for making really bad decisions in the future. And what we know from the literature is that some taxes are better in generating revenue over the business cycle than others. So for example, personal income taxes and corporate income taxes are really, really volatile. They're very unreliable. In good times, you gorge, you have a lot of revenue coming from personal and corporate income taxes. Bad times, you have very little revenue coming from those taxes. So very unreliable taxes to have, in your tax portfolio at the state level. Again, another benefit of sales tax or consumption tax is that it's much more stable over the business cycle in comparison to personal and corporate income taxes. So again, another positive argument for heavy reliance on the consumption tax like a sales tax. So consumption taxes have that additional benefit of being much more stable over the business cycle. And again, another argument for, I think, taking another close look at maybe altering the state tax portfolio towards heavy reliance on consumption taxes. And this is where a lot of specific tax issues arise. Like, what do you tax more? Do you want to have a uniform rate for all products? Do you want to have varying tax rates? And I don't want to get too much into the heavy theory here, but there's a good reason why you might want to have varying tax rates on certain products. For example, consumption of tobacco, alcohol, gasoline, maybe food, and some other services or goods and services, maybe healthcare, is relatively inelastic over the business cycle. People have to eat, right, no matter what. So even in bad times, people have to eat. Even in bad times, people have to drive to work. Even in bad times, people smoke tobacco and alcohol and drink alcohol. So these kinds of items are very stable in consumption over the business cycle in comparison to other items. And so you might want to tax them more for that reason, if you really care about stability of your tax revenues. And so by choosing the right mix of taxes, by varying the rates on different goods in a certain fashion, take advantage of stability of certain consumption patterns, you might be able to provide your state with a very stable tax revenue base. And so to prevent the government from looking for really bad solutions when you have a really hard time. And so in conclusion, I would like to wrap up the presentation. And it's not as exciting as the previous presentations. I'm sure I don't have very cool graphs here, but I have good news, right? Relatively good news. The good news is Pennsylvania is relatively in the middle of the pack compared to many other states. We actually are somewhat better than other states in income tax being flat, and our reliance on some other taxes. And so is there room for improvement? Yes, we can certainly improve some things. We can make a heavier reliance on broad-based taxation. We can broaden our sales taxes. We can lower the rates, make them more competitive. At the same time, we can probably raise more revenue. We can also probably have more stable revenue over the long run. And these are the taxes we should probably focus on, right? So there is some room for improvement. We're starting at a relatively good base, I think, in the state. But again, we can grow faster if we make some really good sound policy decisions, like with regard to taxation. Again, something to watch out for is how regressive these taxes might be. I think you can do something about lowering the regressivity of consumption taxes if you design them the according way, if you design them properly, and so that could help sell those taxes better to the general public by convincing them that these taxes are not going to be as regressive as people typically think, and I think that would be one of the ways to sell those reforms to the general public. And that's it. Questions? Sir? I think somebody else.
I have a question.
Yes.
We're having a debate in Pennsylvania now about getting rid of real property taxes, which is our primary local tax for schools, and replacing it with basically a broadened sales tax. From an economic point of view, how do you feel about that? Because it seems as if real property taxes are very stable, although they've all gone down in this recession, but sales taxes have gone down percentage-wise more in this recession. Of course, education is one of those things where the costs tend to rise. What do you think about that from an economic point of view, forgetting all the other philosophical arguments about people's homes and stuff like that?
Right. I think you highlighted one of the reasons why public finance economists like property taxes, because they're much more stable than consumption taxes, right? And like a sales tax. And that's one of the reasons why economists in my field in public finance like property taxes. And I kind of agree with them. As much as I hate paying them, I really hate paying taxes, my property taxes. I don't have any kids, and I pay for other people's education, essentially. I pay for other services that I don't really benefit from directly, or as much as other people, and as much as I personally don't like paying them. I think most economists in my field would say that property taxes are one of the best way to fund local governments. The alternatives are not as great. So sales taxes are not as great maybe as property taxation in terms of providing a pretty good link between what you get for your money. So people can look at the quality of public schools, people can look at the quality of public services, look at their property taxes and say, this is how much I pay in my district or in my county. Let's look at my neighboring counties, how much are they paying? How good are their schools? And so that creates a competition between many local jurisdictions. And so that I think forces governments to be more efficient in the provision of many local services. They don't want to maybe do that, but it forces them to be more efficient. And they're not clearly as efficient as they should be, but still, we're moving closer to that benchmark of better efficiency, I think, with property taxes, if they're well done, if they're well designed. And I think for that reason, most economists would argue that property taxes, as much as we don't like paying them, are still pretty good, considering the alternatives, right?
I think it's important when you look at property taxes to remember that in Pennsylvania, I don't know about other states, property taxes are heavily encumbered by a web of laws and regulations that do not make them responsive to the economy, nor do they make them responsive to the voters. So from the standpoint of the state, if you're looking at the welfare of the state government, its well-being, right? Sure, let's form a stable revenue source. But then the question for the people is, how big should the state government be? And should the state government respond to the business cycle? The last question I would ask is about consumption taxes that you present as regressive. I say that in fact, sales taxes, consumption taxes are the most progressive taxes there are. And the reason I say that is because a wealthy man cannot live like a wealthy man unless he buys more goods and services, right? So he or she pays a lot more taxes on the $70,000 car they buy every year than on the $5,000 car a poor man buys every 5 years. So that's a very progressive tax. Now, whether or not everyone should pay the exact same amount of their total income is a different question, but that in and of itself is a disincentive to economic growth.
So if I understood right, two-part question. One is the proper role of government, proper size of government in the economy. Again, people have debated that since the beginning of times. Economists have outlined certain aspects of the debate. Public goods externalities, these are things we definitely know the government has a right to be involved in. The extent of it, it's debatable. Again, we know from public choice theory that the government often overprovides certain items. It might overprovide public goods, which leads to growth of government beyond reasonable amount. Again, we provide too much distribution from public choice theory. We know that we redistribute too much. The government gets involved in all kinds of other things it shouldn't be involved in. And so, my opinion, yes, we have too much government. I would like to see less of it. Actually, one point I didn't mention is if you want to rely more on sales taxes, that requires a much smaller government, in my opinion. Why? Well, if you want to get rid of personal income tax, that's going to eliminate a big chunk of revenue for the state government. So you have to make it up somewhere, right? So if you want to make it up with sales taxes, that means higher sales tax rates. You can't take it too far because if your competing states have lower sales tax rates, people are going to buy a lot of stuff there, so you're going to have a lot of cross-border shopping, and people buying more stuff over the internet. So there is a limit to how much you can finance government with sales taxes. You can finance a lot of government with sales taxes if government is relatively small. And I would like to see that personally. From my personal view, I think government is too big in virtually every state. It's definitely big at the federal level, and in my opinion, it should be smaller. Regarding your second point about the sales tax being progressive, I think that's a much more debatable claim that you would make, because the conventional wisdom in economics, and it's not just an opinion, I think there is a lot of evidence behind this, that sales taxes tend to be regressive because poor people buy lots of items that are taxable compared to the rich people. So many of the services that rich people consume are not being taxed by your typical sales tax. And so what happens is that when poor people buy lots of necessities which are taxed at the sales, by the sales tax, you end up having a higher portion of your income taken away in sales taxes when you are a relatively poor household. And so there is a lot of empirical evidence to show that I think sales taxes tend to be regressive. Again, one of the ways to lower that aggressivity is to broaden the tax base, so it includes services as well as goods. So rich people will pay their fair share on services they consume, and they will pay it in sales taxes. Ironically, one of my own research will actually agree more with your point. I looked at the sales tax regressivity in West Virginia, where I did some of my research for my doctoral degree. And in one of my policy briefs for the Bureau of Business Economic Research, we looked at the regressivity of sales taxes in West Virginia, and we found that they're actually very mildly regressive, meaning that sales taxes are pretty neutral in terms of regressivity, which agrees more with your point, but this was just one case for West Virginia. I'm not sure if you can generalize it for other states. Well, a good point. So in West Virginia, a good question. I don't have a 100% answer to that, but in West Virginia, we have a relatively broad-based sales tax. It taxes everything, food, drinks, and so on. And in fact, some of the things we tax them at different rates. So alcohol might be taxed at a different rate, specifically wine. And so if you believe richer people buying better drinks or maybe more upper scale products, maybe nicer bottles of wines, you might be paying a higher sales tax rate on those. And so that creates a more progressive or less regressive distribution of the tax burdens at the sales tax level. So it depends on how you structure your sales tax, depending on what items you tax, right? If you tax the items that rich people buy a lot, you're going to have a lot less regressive or maybe even progressive sales tax. Again, that's my suspicion of what happens in West Virginia.
I have a couple of issues here, but first I really need to respond to Roger's opening statement that the local people and the local government doesn't pay much attention to property taxes that fund local schools. If you believe that, I'd urge you to come to a different township school board meeting where they're going to set tax rates and talk about the quality of schools. It is an enormous issue. So the fact, this comment that you're saying doesn't matter, I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. But there's an awful lot of oversight by the population. Again, I'd urge you to come to a different township board meeting, school board meeting, where they're talking about the expenditures. The other thing is you said that people are interested in the welfare of the state of Pennsylvania, and therefore sales taxes would be better than property taxes. I disagree with that. I'm interested in my local township. We have great schools, a low tax rate. I may sound, somewhat impolitic, but that's what I'm interested in. And I'm not as grandiose as to say, well, I'm really interested in what's good for the overall state of Pennsylvania. So we can have this discussion, I'm sure. I have some questions on your presentation, which I thought was superb. Number one, you don't mention estate taxes. It may be a small issue, but where might that fit in, where you say that not all taxes are created equal?
Great question. I actually have a working paper on the estate tax. My opinion, let's see, I'm going to give you the what I think is a consensus in the literature on the estate tax and in my own opinion. And thank you for thinking my presentation is great. I appreciate it. So regarding the consensus on the estate tax in literature, there is no consensus. So lots of different opinions, very divergent opinions on the estate tax, both on the equity issue, or fairness of that, and its efficiency implications. People, come from different, two sides of debate. Some people really like estate taxes because they think they're progressive and they limit the amount of intergenerational transfer and so on. Other people completely contradict that in their research and say, estate taxes are not very fair at all. They're morally, just really wrong and they're not very fair, and there are really bad efficiency consequences from those taxes as well. My own research suggests, and I look at the efficiency aspect of it primarily. My own research suggests that estate taxes are a terrible way to raise revenue. They're very narrow, and again, that's one of the bad ways to do your tax policies. You don't want to have a very narrow tax policy. You want to have very broad-based taxes, typically. And so these are very narrow taxes. They're pro-cyclical. They're not very stable over the business cycle. They have tremendous inefficiency implications because they might actually decrease the number of businesses you have in your state. What I find in my own research with Anthony Davis, my co-author, is that higher estate taxes lead to fewer firms. So they decrease the number of firms because people have to simply liquidate them to pay the estate tax. And so that's not good for competition. It's not good for making our economy very strong and competitive. and that leads to lower growth. That's my personal opinion from my own research. And so I think, and first of all, they don't collect that much revenue either. So it's an insignificant tax in terms of its revenue generating ability, and it has detrimental growth implications. So I think that would be a terrible way to raise revenue.
I'm delighted to hear that. Would you please publish your paper quickly?
Well, we have a policy paper published, and I think it's published with the Small Family Business Foundation or something like that, Family Small Business Foundation, and we're working on a peer-reviewed version of that.
Great.
So it should come out in the journal hopefully soon.
Another question on the slide where you have the states, and you show, if you could get to that,
Which slide?
the one at the bottom of the page. I got to put my glasses on here. Yeah, okay, that one. You have some that have no income taxes. Does that mean that they rely almost entirely on sales taxes in those states?
I wouldn't say most entirely. Definitely have to rely on something else, right? Question is, what is? And I think it depends a lot on the nature of the state economy. So depending on what's available there, some states might rely more on sales taxes, others might rely more on severance taxes, which are taxes on natural resources. So in states like West Virginia, for example, there is a lot of reliance on severance taxes, well, even though we have income tax there. But just to give you an example, they're trying to find something to tax, right? You can either tax consumption, again, to a limited degree, because if you tax it too much, a lot of that activity will go to other states with lower tax rates. So there is a limit to how much you can tax consumption. Hawaii managed to tax relatively little and at a very broad base aspect, so they were able to actually collect a lot of revenue from sales taxes. But other states are not like that, so they have to rely on something else. Maybe severance taxes, maybe sin taxes, lottery taxes. So there's a lot of variety of what states look at to make up for that revenue that they don't get from the income tax. And Florida is a very special case of its own. It has a big tourism industry, so it can rely on a lot of hotel taxes. Again, sales taxes are pretty good. Give a lot of revenue in Florida state, and so I think it depends a lot on the state, because there's just so much difference in some states' economies that you look at different tax instruments.
One last question, and then my wife is saying, "Shut up." The tax capacity and tax effort. How do you measure tax capacity?
In my opinion, tax capacity is just another measure of GDP. They look essentially at personal income in measuring tax capacity. So roughly, it's very close to GDP. If you look at state GDP, it will be very close to tax capacity. And I think it's a somewhat of a, dishonest way of looking at total amount of revenue you could raise, because you could never raise 100% of GDP in terms of revenue. You're simply not going to have 100% tax rates. It's just insane. That's not going to happen. So it's kind of this hypothetical scenario. This is how many resources we have. This is our tax capacity. Clearly, in reality, it's much, much less than that, right? And so tax capacity is just kind of I think, an interesting conceptual exercise that you can use, but it's somewhat dishonest in terms of looking at the true tax capacity that you could have. It's just a convenient number that we can throw out there, but it's not very meaningful.
You mentioned efficiency earlier, and I'm wondering, are there taxes that government can collect more efficiently than other taxes? Like how much it costs to administer a program versus another?
Right, it's a great question. I didn't have time to talk about that. That's kind of a separate issue. Different taxes take a lot of different resources to collect. Some taxes are easier to collect than others, and so that certainly is another aspect. The cost benefit of tax instruments, and there's a lot of research on that, a lot of literature on that. But I think that pales in comparison to the behavioral effects. So when I refer to efficiency, I refer to the behavioral effects of taxation. And as you pointed out, another thing to keep in mind is, if we're raising very little revenue, but we spend a lot of government resources to collect that revenue, maybe it's not worth it. For example, estate tax, I think, is one of those taxes. If we spend a lot of government resources to collect the estate tax, and we don't really collect that much, so considering the costs of collection divided by the revenue that we get, it's not going to rank all that high in terms of, is this the best usage of our money? Probably not.
And we'll have our final question with this gentleman here.
I don't know how to ask this. I think we focus too much on the revenue generating side of the balance sheet when the real problem is the expenditure side. For instance, I don't think property taxes would be an issue in Pennsylvania if education spending wasn't literally out of control. And we've looked at a lot of budgets, municipal, county, obviously state. Some of those have slowed down with the economic slowdown. However, they typically grow at more than twice the rate of inflation per capita. So is there some, I guess the way to ask this is, I don't think focusing on the revenue mix is as important as controlling the spending, but is there some revenue mix that could ever keep pace with growing at twice the rate of economic growth or inflation, or is it just going to constantly be a losing battle?
I think you raise an excellent question, and I do agree. I think the problem is spending, not taxation. It will be a problem once we spend too much and we can't raise sufficient revenue, but at this point we can't collect those taxes, right? And it's not good to be spent that much, and I think that deals more with Matt's presentation. I think he pretty much highlighted the problem of spending, government spending specifically. This is the problem we face. Taxation is simply a way to finance that, I think, irresponsible spending. What I would like to say is there is a way to tweak the tax system, in my opinion, as to limit taxation, spending, right? If you want to limit spending and you're looking for ways to do that, I think taxation could be one of those, right? For example, as Matt suggested, making stricter balanced budget requirements so people can equate the tax side with the expenditure side, so they don't think it's free money, right? This money is coming from. Making taxes very visible is very important, so people see those taxes. So if you rely more on indirect taxes or hidden taxes, people are not going to see the true size of government because they don't see that. They don't read every year what the budget is. The average person on the street does not know the true size of government, and they only judge it by their paycheck typically. And so the more taxes you can make visible, the more people will realize how big the government is. And I think one of the ways to make government feel really big and really visible to people is to look at a flat income tax rate. Because what happens typically is the majority of population is not your Bill Gates, right? They're not the rich people. Most of them do not experience really high marginal tax rates that the wealthy ones pay. But the vast majority of revenue comes from more well-off people. And so the more the average person will feel those tax rates that the high income people feel, the more they will realize how truly big the government is. So I think one of the enemies of limited government is actually progressive income tax, because it hides the true burden of taxation and government in general. That's my suspicion.
Thank you, Pavel, and thank you to all our speakers, although you are not off the hook yet, because in just a minute we'll break over to the next room for lunch and a panel discussion where we can chew on these topics a little bit more, as well as chew on our food. That's a pun I did not intend to make. And also talk about how we as engaged citizens, as activists, can use this information and knowledge. The reason that we're talking today about tax rates and unemployment and state institution spending is that so you and I can better communicate to our peers, to our neighbors and friends, why we need to return to a limited government, why we need to return to the founding principles that our founding fathers intended. As government has grown and grown, we see that more and more people are looking to government to solve their problems, even though problems are best solved at the local level. And it's because of this great imbalance of power in our federal government right now that we face the greatest threat to our liberty since the Revolutionary War. And the parallels there are really, I think, interesting, because just like you and I, most of us in this room are not economists. Back in the Revolutionary War, these were average people that were standing up against oppressive government and bureaucratic excess because they were concerned about their families, about their future, and about their principles that they knew were good and right. And the principles that our founding fathers embraced, that the people are sovereign and that the people determine the legitimacy of the government, these principles are as relevant now as they were in 1776. And so we talk about the Constitution because the Constitution is what establishes and says that we need a limited government to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to secure the blessings of liberty. So it's so important that we're able to communicate why we need to return there, and that we understand what the Constitution and our founding principles, what they established. So even though we look at some of the depressing charts, and as government grows and grows and grows, we want to be able to communicate why this is not setting us up for success. This is not the path that our founders intended for us. We need to be able to explain that, that limiting government is what's going to return us to an economy where entrepreneurship and risk-taking, where these thrive and flourish, so that we can continue to have innovations that change our lives, that improve them, that save lives as well. And so it's with this understanding that we're better able to communicate why we need to return to these founding principles, but it's also so important that you and I understand the Constitution and the founding principles, because that is the standard by which we have to measure all of our policies and laws and interpretations. So I really encourage you to take advantage of the panel discussion and to write down questions or to be thinking of them. And also, please to utilize us as a resource, whether it's to help more with digging deeper into these economic principles, or just to have a really stronger grasp on our founding principles. And I know all of you have great spheres of influence. That's why you are invited here today. And we want to be able to equip you with those tools. So please reach out to me. You have my contact information, and you'll be hearing from me as well. However I can help really to equip you with the intellectual ammunition that we can reverse this course and get back to the economy and community and society that our founders intended. And so with that, we will break for lunch, which is right in the room next door. And it is set up buffet style, so you can just form a line and begin to help yourselves. And we'll start the panel discussion in about 15 or 20 minutes. So please take your stuff, your notes and purses with you. There's a wedding later today, so they're going to be breaking down this room. So take your items with you and your question cards. If you have written down a question, please you can hand it to me, to Nate, Mike and Emily over there. And also, we will let you raise your hands and ask questions as well. So don't worry if you don't have it all set yet. Thanks, Joe.